so welcome back. I am the speaker for now. So my name is Shalabh Bhatnagar. I work at the Indian Institute of Science. This is essentially a swap between the two topics. Essentially, I was supposed to give this on Saturday, but I thought that I'll do it now. The reason being that there will be some elements of stochastic optimization that I thought I'll take you through, and that will be relevant in the other talk as well. Alright, so this is largely the outline of what I am going to be talking about. So I'll take you through some aspects of stochastic optimization methods, and then talk about Q-learning with function approximation, and then discuss some of the problems that Rich has talked about in Q-learning with function approximation, and then our tweak to that algorithm of Q-learning with function approximation. Basically, we have sort of switched between time scales, made it a 2-time scale algorithm, and then it appears that it converges. I mean, Q-learning with function approximation is known not to converge. There are results that suggest that it does not converge. But we have a proof that the multi-time scale version of Q-learning does. And then I'll talk about some applications of this algorithm that we have developed to this problem of finding optimal sleep-wake schedules and sensor networks. So here is the problem. Essentially, so the broad overall objective is the following. So let's say J is your given objective function. J is a map from R power n to R. Okay, R power n is an n-dimensional Euclidean space. And essentially what you are, so let's say J has that form. J of x is expectation over mu of h of x comma mu. So that mu is a random variable. Think of it as noise. So the expectation is with respect to the distribution of the noise. And so J of x is that essentially. Okay, so the goal is to find a point x star that minimizes J of x. So you want to find over all possible x in R power n, take the minimum of J and get to an x star. Find the corresponding value J of x star. Now note the problem is that because J of x has that form, so it's not clear what the functional form of J is, and therefore in order to find x star you first need to estimate J itself, and that is not clear. I mean, how you would do that unless you have some handle on mu itself. And many times therefore it is more convenient to talk about local optima instead of directly jumping into global optima. So here is a small take on stochastic approximation. Essentially Borkar had reviewed some of this, but let's go through it one more time in my way. So the idea is this. So let's say you want to solve that system of equations f of theta equals 0. Okay, then you really don't know the functional form of f. And what you however know is so essentially this is the deal. So here is this function f, here is this block. So if you plug in theta, if you input theta into this, what you observe is not f of theta but this noise corrupted observation, f of theta plus noise. So this you don't really observe the f of theta and the noise in isolation. Essentially you observe them as a sum. Okay, so this is what you do. Now the point is that given these noisy observations, can you still get to a theta star that actually satisfies f of theta star is 0? Okay, so you still want to find that theta star that minimizes f. So Robbins and Monroe in this classic paper in 1951, essentially, so that's where this entire theory of stochastic approximation algorithm started. So what they suggested is the following. So they said that, well, as long as I know that I can plug in, if I plug in theta, I don't observe f of theta, but I observe f of theta plus noise. So the observer is sitting here, it's not here. So what they said is, well, we'll design an algorithm, and what they did was that if you take that observation of f of theta plus noise, multiply it with some quantity a of n, that's the step size, and add it to the previous value of theta to get a new theta, and sort of do this over and over again. So in a sense the algorithm is closing the loop. Okay, so here is the algorithm, and the algorithm is essentially what is written up there. The nice thing about this is that if you impose some conditions on the step sizes, the ANs and also the function f and so on, you can essentially show that the sequence of iterations theta n converge to a theta star, and that's the theta star that actually satisfies f of theta star is 0. I mean, that's what you actually wanted to do in the first place. So that's the magic. I mean, the magic is that the noise somehow vanishes in the asymptotic limit. Alright. And over the years, this has been expanded. I mean, what they started out with was that the noise is IID, and essentially in the asymptotic limit you can get rid of the noise. But over the years this has been and moreover their result was in the mean square sense. I mean, so they showed that theta n will converge to theta star in the mean square sense. But over the years, over these previous decades, essentially this algorithm has been significantly expanded. I mean, its convergence has been enhanced to include not just IID noise, but martingale difference noise, and also you can have Markovian noise and so on. And then its analysis essentially is, so the results that are available now are almost sure. So you can show that theta n converges to theta star with probability 1. Okay, so alright, so that's essentially what it is. So if you don't trust that this is general enough, that the noise is additive, so let's say you have this form of this function f, wherein the objective has this noise component getting in as an argument rather than it adding up. So now what you can do is to, let's say we call this expectation of this, whatever the noisy objective that you have given theta n, let's call that as capital F of theta n. And so you can rewrite it. So essentially if you look at this algorithm, and so what you do is to rewrite this. So this becomes that, wherein Mn plus 1 is just the difference of these two. And there is again mean 0 and it constitutes a noise. You can see that it is a martingale difference and it satisfies, you can, under some conditions it satisfies certain nice properties, and again the analysis of convergence goes through. So what I'll do is, so Borkar has this nice book. I mean, if you are, so this is also available in Indian print for about 200 rupees. So you can essentially, it's a good idea to buy this book, and it gives you a good overview of stochastic approximation, even though it's somewhat more mathematical. And so you will have to first understand basics of advanced probability and so on. So here is an example from that book. So it's actually in the first chapter itself. So let's say we have the following. So here is an urn. So let's say there is an urn, an empty vessel, and there is a collection, an infinite collection of say red and black balls. So the black balls are shaded by this shaded, and the red balls are not shaded. And what you do is that at any point in time, you pick a ball from this infinite collection and drop it into the urn. You don't really see what you are dropping, and you pick it at random and just drop it. And what you are interested in is this, the long run fraction of red balls that are in the urn. Okay, so that's what you care about. I mean, how many red balls have I ultimately dropped into the urn over an infinite horizon. So let's assume that yn is the number of red balls that you drop into the urn at time n. I mean, so right, so sorry, that you have dropped in the urn by time n. I'm sorry, that shouldn't be at time n, by time n. And let's say then xn is the fraction of red balls in the urn by time n. So note that at time n you would have dropped n balls, right? Because you are dropping one ball at a time. So xn is then yn by n, right? So that's the fraction. Now let's say we denote by xi n plus 1 as the random variable, that is just the indicator function whether you are dropping the red ball at this nth instant or not. So xi n plus 1 is 1 if the nth ball that you drop is red, otherwise it is 0. Okay. So note that yn sort of can be written out in this recursion. So yn plus 1 is yn plus xi n plus 1. So if you drop the red ball, if it is 1, right, if xi n plus 1 is 1, then the number of red balls at time n plus 1 goes up by 1. Otherwise it remains the same as what it was previously. Now again what you can do is to divide throughout by n plus 1, right? And essentially note that the quantity on the left is nothing but xn plus 1. And so, okay, so if you look at what yn by n plus 1 is, you can just see that yn by n plus 1 can be rewritten as n by n plus 1 times yn by n, and this is nothing but xn, so it is n by n plus 1 into xn, right? And that's what this is, okay? And then you have plus yn plus 1 by n plus 1. And so you have a recursion now. So xn plus 1 is a recursion in terms of xn and the yn plus 1. Okay, there is no yn now. Alright, so you can rewrite this as xn plus 1 is xn plus 1 over n plus 1 times yn plus 1 minus xn. Okay, so yeah. No, you just pick them up. So I'll come to that. And so there is a distribution by which you pick up. So let's say, yeah, so I'll come to that. But the observer is actually not seeing while he is just following the distribution. He is just picking that according to the distribution and dumping it. So let's say that P is a map from 0, 1 to 0, 1. And let it be the probability that the n plus first ball is red, given that you know the history of these red and black balls that you have been dropping into this urn. Okay, that you have done so until time n. And so basically that essentially is just P of xn. So if you know that time 0 I dropped the black ball, then at time 1 the red ball, and so on, all the way up to time n. If the probability that the next ball is going to be red, given all this entire history, just depends on xn. So essentially all I care about is this fraction of red balls that are there. Okay, so that's an assumption. Okay, so let's say P of xn is that probability. So what you can do is to rewrite this algorithm again. You can rewrite it in this manner. Okay, so it is 1 by n plus 1 times P of xn minus xn. And what you do is to just subtract out this term. Okay, so add and subtract that. Now the important thing to note is that if you take the conditional expectation of this quantity given the entire history, that's still 0. So it's a martingale difference in that sense, right? And so this is the deterministic part of the algorithm, and this is the randomness that is adding on. So it's back into the original framework. And so one can write down an associated ordinary differential equation, and which is that precisely x dot t is P of xt minus xt. The P of xt minus xt is again coming from here. So this is, so you can think of this as, so what you do loosely rather, you think of it as xn plus 1 minus xn divided by 1 by n plus 1. So that's something like x dot, and what you have is P of xt minus t and ignores the noise. So okay, so very loosely speaking, that's what it is. So this is the ODE that you get. So think of the algorithm as a noisy discretization of this ODE. And of course, noisy Euler discretization, except that Euler discretization would give you an increment h at each iteration. Let h be 1 by n plus 1. So those are the non-uniform step sizes. Now the thing to note is that because P maps 0, 1 to 0, 1, so and x can go all the way from 0 to 1, so if xt is 1, then x dot t is going to be less than or equal to 0. And on the other hand, if xt is 0, then x dot t is going to be greater than or equal to 0. Right now, if you assume that P is a Lipschitz continuous map, which means that, let's say there exists an L for which mod difference of Px minus Py is less than or equal to L times mod x minus y, then it can be shown that this ODE is actually well posed. What that means is that if you start your ODE from any given initial condition and look at the trajectory of this ODE, so as a function of the initial condition, if you change that initial condition, move that around by a small delta amount, the entire trajectory would continue to remain within an epsilon ball. Okay, so it's a function, it's a continuous function of that initial condition. Okay, so because of this Lipschitz continuity, what you can also see is that the trajectories of this ODE, they are going to be continuous anyway. So, okay, so if you are starting, let's say from 0, okay, so let's say you're moving in the direction starting from 0 or anywhere in the interval 0 to 1. Let's say you start, the trajectory starts out in the right direction. It can't continuously go on in the right direction because it will exceed 1. right? So at some point in time, because of the fact that if you come closer to 1, essentially then the derivative is going to be less than equal to 0, so you have to turn left. Okay, so the trajectory will turn left at some point, and before it turns left, it will actually become 0. So x dot t will be 0, and that point is precisely the equilibrium point. So that's where you stop. Okay, the ODE trajectory will stop at, so there will exist an x star wherein this vanishes. So x dot t will be 0, and that's essentially will be the point where p of x star will be equal to x star. Okay, so you have actually solved the problem of finding the fixed point of this function p. And you can actually then show that your recursion that was there earlier, that this recursion will actually converge to that x star, okay, assuming that x star is unique. Now if it is not unique, then it can converge to the entire set of x star, x's, for which p of x equals x. Okay, so it can actually sit in that set. I mean, that set could be a continuum, so it's, all you can say is that it will sit in that set in the asymptotic limit. Okay, so here is another example again from Burker's book. So let's say we look at this. We have a repeated experiment, and what we have is the following. So let's say xn is your, xn's are the inputs andyn's are the outputs. Xn's are m dimensional and sayyn's are p dimensional. Now we'll assume that xn, yn, these tuples are IID. Right? They are independent and have the same distribution. Now what we are interested in doing is to estimateyn's. So suppose you are have a system wherein if you input xn, you observe yn. Now it may so happen that many times you may not have that luxury of actually estimating, gettingyn's. I mean, so let's say these observations are costly. Okay, so it's not very cost effective to always input xn and see yn. So you might want to estimate. So suppose I have these observations. Now in the future, if there is an input, what will be the output? So in order to do that, what I am doing is, let's say I have a parameterized family of functions fw that is parameterized by some w in Rd, and what I am trying to do is do a curve fitting. So I am just trying to fit in within this parameterized class of functions, what is the right function to choose. Okay, that will, in the future, if there is an input, that will tell me what should be the output. What would be the output? So let's say I do this. So yn is fw of xn plus epsilon n, where epsilon n is the noise. Okay, so that's the error. So not the noise, it's the error in the observation. So the best fit is then characterized via this mean square error. I mean, there could be, you can think of some other objectives as well. We will care about the mean square error for now. So let's say the mean square error is this. So g of w is characterized as this. The half of the expected value of this is the Euclidean norm, let's say, of epsilon n square. And epsilon n being what it is, so it's just norm of yn minus fw of xn. Take the square of that, take its expectation, half of that. So the goal is then to find a w star that minimizes g of w over all w in r power d. Alright. Now what can be possible examples of fw? You can think of polynomials, sines, cosines, neural networks, whatever else. I mean, so as long as you have a parameterized family of functions, all you care about is what is the right parameter to pick. That will, within this parameterized class, give me the optimum, give me the right parameter value, and which I will use subsequently on. So that when if I am given an input, I will know what the corresponding output is. So let's assume that each input-output pair, let's call that xn comma yn, that is being delivered to you one at a time in real time. And we'll assume that fw, this parameterized family of functions, so this function as a function of the parameter is continuously differentiable in w. So then if you do this computation, if you find what grad g w is, so it will be half of the gradient of the expectation of that quantity. This is just the inner product. This is just the notation I use for the inner product of yn minus fw of xn with itself, because it's a Euclidean norm square. Okay, so if I suppose I am able to take this gradient inside this expectation somehow, I mean, so there are conditions and that will guarantee this. Of course, those are somewhat strict assumptions, and we'll come to that subsequently. But suppose you are allowed that. Suppose that is a legal operation, right? So you do require conditions under which that can be assured, but let's assume that those are valid. So this interchange is valid, let's assume. So then if this, so the expectation of the gradient of this entire thing can be rewritten in this manner. So that's, so the computation, so the gradient enters here and then the half goes off because you have the inner product of this quantity with itself. And then, so actually what you need to do is then what we care about is the W star that minimizes G of W, so let's equate that to 0 to find the minimum point. The trouble is, of course, you don't really know what the expectation is because you don't know the distribution that is there, right? I mean, so what you can do then is to, let's say, okay, so even if you know what the gradient is, let's say we plug it into this stochastic approximation scheme, which would be this. But again, you don't know what the expectation is, as I said. So what you can do is then to remove the expectation and run this. Okay, so that's a gradient scheme, except that it's not the true gradient, it's a noisy estimate of the gradient. It's one sample that you are just plugging in. Now because these are all IID, so this will be a correlated random walk, essentially, because these are all IID samples that are coming in, and this will be a correlated random walk that will zigzag all its way, right? And you don't want that to happen. So what you can do is to take a convex combination of Wn with whatever you have on the right. So let's say we let An be something that is less than 1, which it will eventually be, because the kind of step sizes that we care about, they will eventually be diminishing. Okay, they will eventually go down. So essentially, okay, so think of An as something like maybe 1 over n. Okay, so that's certainly something that can be thought of as less than 1. If you don't want to make that assumption of An being less than 1, think of this recursion starting at some point and not from where on An is less than 1. Okay, till that time you don't really care, because anyway you are in the amount that by which you will be off will anyway be a finite quantity. Right, and so if you write it in this manner, then the same thing can be rewritten in this way. So now there is a valid stochastic approximation scheme, and what you can do is to rewrite this in this manner. So you take the expectation, and then you bring this additional term An of Mn plus 1, where Mn plus 1 is the difference. This is what you had to begin with, minus the expectation. So all you have done is to add and subtract the expectation term. Okay, now once you do that, if you take the conditional expectation of Mn plus 1 given Wn, that will still be 0. So it's again a martingale difference noise sequence. And if you look at the corresponding ODE, if you write it down, this is what the ODE will look like. W dot T is minus grad G of Wt. Right, now this ODE will converge to this set. I mean, if you start your ODE from any given initial point, you can think of G as your Lyapunov function. G will turn out to be a Lyapunov function by itself. So this, okay, so if you look at this ODE, W dot P equals minus grad G of W of T. Okay, so let's say we have this H as this set of all W for which grad G of W is 0. So since I said that G is a Lyapunov function, so this is Lyapunov. And therefore if you look at dg by dt, okay, so dg of W, let's say dg of W by dt, this can be written as grad GW transpose W dot, and which is then minus norm grad G of W square. And you can see that this is a quantity that is strictly less than 0 as long as this is not 0. Okay, so this outside of H for all W not in H, this is what it will be, and it will be 0 in H. Okay, for W in H. So eventually your ODE will converge to this set. So this is the set of all asymptotically stable equilibria. And then you can show that the algorithm itself will converge to that set. Okay, so the algorithm will asymptotically track your ODE because it's so the formal analysis is much more involved. But I can say it essentially in this, so unless we go through the formal analysis, till that time you can say that, well, because the algorithm is a noisy Euler discretization and you are somehow controlling the noise, So you can think of it as asymptotically tracking the stable fixed points of the ODE, and the stable fixed points of the ODE lie in H, so the algorithm will converge to H. And roughly that's the argument, but it has to be done much more rigorously.
A couple of questions. The first one is to show that it's a Lyapunov function, but the convergence depends on how fast the grad G grows, right? Because just being negative outside the set H is not enough, right? You might not converge fast enough, right?
No, this is as far as the ODE is concerned.
Okay.
So it's just if you look at the trajectory of the ODE, so this will converge to the set H.
Okay.
But as far as the algorithm is concerned, yeah, it is more involved, and the argument is more involved.
The second question I had is how does this convergence depend on the dimensionalities of Y and X and so on and W?
So right now, okay, so right now it is just a scalar, because no, it's not a scalar. Sorry, it's this example.
Yeah.
No, so it doesn't depend on as long as it's a finite Euclidean space, finite dimensional Euclidean space, it's okay.
I see. But will the rate possibly depend on
the convergence can depend.
Okay. And is there any insight into that rates depending on the dimensionality?
On the dimensionalities,
because you could, for instance, probably have very high dimensional Y's, but the space of parameters can again be very small, sort of.
Okay. No, but we are caring for the convergence in the W's, right? So that's all we care about.
Right. So in some sense, it should not depend on the dimensionality of Y's, right? It should only depend on the space in which W lives, right? I think.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, I'll have to look up at the rate results. I mean, in this particular example, how it actually translates. I mean, we'll have to think about that some more. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let's recall. I mean, this will be the starting point of the talk. So these were the examples that we were looking at. So let's recall again the optimization problem. So the optimization problem was this. So let's say you had that f of theta n with f. You wanted to find the zeros of this function f of theta, and psi n's are the noise random variables. Okay, so in this particular instance, let's say f of theta is grad j of theta. J is some objective function. So now assuming that j of theta has this form, so j of theta n is expected value of some g of theta n comma eta n. Eta n is the noise again. Alright, and given theta n, and let's say that g is sufficiently smooth and the dynamics is smooth and so on, so that this is a legally valid operation. So grad of j is the expectation of the gradient of g. So this is, as I said, this is not always true, because this is the gradient of the expectation. You can't always swap the two. I mean, but let's say this is legal. Suppose you have, and there are systems for which you can do that. Okay. So for those systems, perturbation analysis is a technique that has been commonly employed. So if you want to learn more about perturbation analysis, here is a good reference. Okay, by Yu-Chi Ho and Shiren Chow on perturbation analysis of discrete event systems, even though this is a fairly old reference. I mean, more newer references are by Cassandra's, I think. So that's in 1994 or maybe in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, he has had a more recent edition of his book. So what this suggests is the following. So you run this. So okay, so suppose G is some performance measure that you are observing on a certain sample path. So on that sample path, you take the gradient of G, and whatever observations you obtain, you just plug them into this algorithm and run this algorithm. So what will happen is that you can replace this by the expectation of this quantity, and then take the difference of, so add and subtract the expectation. So then this gradient of the performance difference, the expectation again will be a martingale difference sequence, and whose mean will be 0 and so on. And so then now we know that the expectation of the gradient is nothing but the gradient of the expectation, and that's what we care about. So this will track that ODE, and therefore you will converge to a minimum of the performance metric, of the average performance. Now all this requires only one system simulation. All you need is just simulate your system with theta n, the running parameter, and along that parameter theta n, you just take the gradient of this expectation. gradient of this sample performance. Now wherever it works, so this is the perturbation analysis method. I mean, wherever it works well, but it doesn't work always. That's the problem. Okay, so and it works well because you need only one system simulation. So the question is, suppose you are not able to do this interchange. Suppose you don't have a system wherein this is legally valid. Then what do you do? So the answer came much earlier. I mean, so essentially Kiefer and Wolfowitz in this paper in 1952 gave an algorithm that would estimate the gradient of the average performance. What they said was, let's say I have so let's say I have a scalar parameter. So suppose for now that theta is a scalar, theta is just r valued. Okay, so what they said is you just run two simulations, one of them with this parameter theta plus delta. Okay, so forget the EI. Okay, so for now let's say you just have theta plus delta and theta minus delta. This is what they said. So let's say we have two simulations, one running with theta plus delta, the other with theta minus delta, and of course theta is a scalar. Theta takes values in R. Okay, so you estimate your performance metric. So let's say J of theta plus delta and plus noise is what you observe. Okay, so this is what you observe on the first simulation, and on the second what you observe is J of theta minus delta plus another noise. And let's say these noise random variables, they satisfy the property that E of xi plus given theta is the expectation of xi minus given theta, and that is 0. Both of these quantities are 0. So what they said was that you can take the derivative dj theta by d theta and estimate it in this manner, that limit as delta goes to 0 of j of theta plus delta and plus j of theta minus delta divided by 2 delta. Okay, and then of course you will have noise terms as well. So there will be some xi plus minus xi minus divided by 2 delta as well. And this is something that you will have to worry about. Okay, so in the limit, of course, if this is all deterministic, then this is valid. Essentially, we all know that. Now, okay, so if you have something like an n-dimensional parameter, say theta n, suppose theta is n-dimensional, I think that's what. Okay, so some capital N. Okay, so theta is some capital n-dimensional quantity. And now let's say EI is this vector, that is a vector of all zeros except that this one is sitting in the ith place. Okay, the corresponding. So the EI is denotes, so the I in EI tells you where the one is going to be sitting in this vector that is otherwise full of zeros. So what they suggested was this algorithm. Okay, so the algorithm is, so this is just the Robbins-Monroe scheme, except that instead of the gradient, this is how you are estimating the gradient. And then these are the noise terms. Alright. Now, why does it work? Well, if you perform the Taylor's expansions, you can see that J of theta n plus delta EI is J of theta n plus delta times EI transpose grad J of theta n, which is nothing but grad I J of theta n, and then you have little o of delta. And similarly, you have J of theta n minus delta EI is this. And you take the difference of this, divide by 2 delta, what you recover is the true gradient in the ith. So this is the ith partial, and then this is capital O of delta. Alright, so in the limit as delta goes to 0, this quantity is going to yield you the exact ith partial. Okay, evaluated at theta n. And that is why it works. Okay, now the reason why this is a bad algorithm is that not because it converges, not because it gives you the true gradient, but because of the fact that if you are in a high dimensional setting, so let's say n is large, so which means that what you will require is actually 2n system simulations. So you require one system simulation with theta plus delta E1, another with theta plus delta E2, go all the way up to theta plus delta En, and then you require a system simulation with theta minus delta E1, theta minus delta E2, all the way up to theta minus delta En. So these are 2n system simulations that you would need in order to estimate the gradient once. Okay, so that's a significant computational overhead if you are working with a real system where in the parameter is really high dimensional. Okay, so suppose we have had instances of working with vehicular traffic networks where the parameter can be significantly large, can be say 100 or 200 dimensional. And therein, if you run so many simulations, you need 200 simulations for at every instant, and you can't really do that. And particularly because your system could be is a huge in itself. So it's always optimal to run with a fewer number of parameters. And that's where random search techniques play a role. So now in this year 1992, James Spall essentially came up with this nice idea. And this algorithm that he proposed, which is again a version of the Robbins-Monroe algorithm, but then it is far more efficient. And the reason why it is far more efficient is that this requires only 2 simulations, regardless of the parameter dimension. So what he said was, whatever n is, and it could be 100, 200, 1000, million, I only need 2 simulations at any instant, and that's about it. Now the reason why it works is the following. Okay, so the algorithm first. So what the algorithm says is this. So what he said was that, let's say delta is this vector of delta 1 to delta n, and again being the parameter dimension. And let's say these delta i's are such that they are symmetric Bernoulli IID random variables. So delta in is plus minus 1 with probability half. Okay, so all you do is just toss a coin, and if it is below, if the result that you get is below 0.5, as say that the random variable takes the value minus 1. If it is above 0.5, say that the random value takes the value plus 1. That's all you need to do as far as generating these random variables is concerned. So what he said was that, well, I'll add a small perturbations little delta and generate these random vectors. Now delta n is this vector of all these n random variables. So I have theta n, I perturb it by this quantity delta times delta n. So this is a random direction. And so this is one simulation, and in the other simulation I do the minus of it. So here is plus, here is minus, but this delta n is exactly the same as that delta n. Now note that whereas in the Kiefer-Wolfowitz scheme, again, okay, so the Kiefer-Wolfowitz scheme was this. So he was generating all these 2n simulations and then dividing by 2 delta, right, in order to get an estimate of the gradient once. Here you just have 2 simulations, but then the complexity from the numerator has in a sense shifted to the denominator. So here the delta, so the ith component, the relevant component is delta in. So that's what you are dividing with. So that gives you an estimate of the ith partial. Okay, so we still need to see why this works. So the reason why it works is the following. So let's say we take Taylor series expansions again of this quantity j of theta n plus delta delta n and j of theta n minus delta delta n around the point theta n. So now what you have is this. So the j of theta n plus delta delta n is the quantity on the right, and j of theta n minus delta delta n is this. Now if you take the difference of these two, divide by 2 delta delta n, what you get is this quantity and then O of delta. Now what is this quantity? This quantity, if you expand, this is nothing but grad I j theta n, and in addition you get this term. Okay, so this is not really giving you the ith partial. Okay, it's not giving you the ith partial as such. It is giving you something more, and that is something that you didn't want in the first place. So it's giving you something more on top of the ith partial as well. It says that, well, I'll give you something more. So it's like that buy one get one free. So you get something free in addition, which you probably don't care about. Okay, so then the question is, what role does this quantity play? Okay, so if you take the conditional expectation of this given theta n, so you recover this, and then the conditional expectation comes to this term. Now because of the fact that the delta ens are plus minus 1 with probability half, this term goes off, this drops off completely. So this is out of the equation now, so the entire quantity vanishes, and what you recover is this. So if you use these gradient estimates in your stochastic approximation scheme, and that's what Spal did. Essentially, he is using them in the stochastic approximation scheme. So we know that I can take the conditional expectation of this given theta n, and then take the difference of this quantity with the conditional expectation. That new thing is the noise, and that I can take care of the noise. And so all I need to worry about is the conditional expectation of that quantity given theta n, and that I know now that drops, and the bias terms drop off, and all I get is the ith partial that I was interested in to begin with. Okay, so even though the Kiefer-Wolfowitz scheme would have given me this result without the expectation, the Spal's SPSA gives me this result with this conditional expectation. So that's the difference between the two. But now so the point is that even though it does not seem like to be as robust an estimate as the Kiefer-Wolfowitz, because Kiefer-Wolfowitz would have done this regardless of the conditional expectation. When you have a high dimensional setting, this turns out to be much better than Kiefer-Wolfowitz, because to simulate the entire system so many times, I mean, so if n is like 1 million, then you need to run 2 million simulations of your system in order to update the parameter once. So if you have a limited computational budget, you can't really do much with it. Okay, you can't really run your scheme completely. So Spal's algorithm has been very widely used in a host of areas. I mean, you can find any number of application papers, and there's a website of SPSA. I mean, just type SPSA on Google, and you will find a whole list of an entire website that contains all references on SPSA. And essentially, there are applications in chemical engineering, there are applications in operations research, in signal processing, robotics, all, I mean, you just name it, there are papers, you can find papers that use SPSA because of the ease of its implementation.
Question?
Yeah.
So if n is really large, the dimension, the variance of this estimate is quite large, right?
No, so okay, so as far as this estimate is concerned, it doesn't do so badly, and I'll come to another estimate that does badly, that actually whose variance is actually going to be very large. See, the point is that because of the fact that you have this quantity, the step size that is multiplying, and the step size is actually pushing it down. Okay. So that will control it. Okay. So then Han-Fu Chen and et al., they came up with another algorithm. I mean, that works like Spal's. So what they said was that I don't need the minus of the algorithm that runs with the theta n minus delta n. I'll just have a simulation that runs with theta n and another simulation that runs with theta n plus delta n. I can take the difference of the two, and well, you can see that this is also valid. I mean, you can work this through. I mean, in a similar manner, this will be true as well. So their algorithm would work equally well, I mean, at least theoretically. Now Spal in 1997 came up with another algorithm. He called it the one simulation SPSA. So the earlier one was to use two simulations. Now there is a one simulation version. So what he said was, I'll drop the theta minus delta per simulation altogether. I'll just work with one simulation that runs with this and have this in the denominator. Now this is an algorithm. Well, so the question is, why should it work? Well, again, if you use a Taylor-Series expansion, expand this around theta n, the quantity j of theta n plus delta n, it is what you get, divide by delta n. So you have this as your, okay, so what you have is ultimately this. So this is what you wanted, but then in addition, this was a term that was there in the two simulation SPSA as well, but in addition you also have this term, j of theta n divided by delta n. Now, why should that vanish? Well, again, because of the fact that delta INs are plus minus 1 with probability half. So we know that this term vanishes, and this term would also vanish if you take the expectation. Okay, and therefore this is valid. But the performance of this algorithm is not so good, and the simple reason why it is not good is because of the fact that there is a little delta sitting in the denominator. Now this little delta typically is small. and it could be like 0.1. If you set it to be a constant, it could be 0.1 or 0.01 and so on, and therefore the variance will go up. Okay, and so this is not a good algorithm to work with. Okay, so in general, if you have a gradient search algorithm, it would be something like that, wherein Wn plus 1 could be either noise or error due to discretization. And the grad hat j theta n would be an estimate of the grad j theta n, and it could be written in this manner. So the En could be something that goes to 0 almost surely, so you can assume that, let's say, En is something that is uniformly bounded for now, almost surely. So let's say En is a quantity that goes to 0, or it could be that if it doesn't go to 0, you require this, that the expectation of En given theta n is 0. Or the most general thing would be that En is the sum of E1 and E2, where one part is mean 0, the other goes to 0. In any of those situations, you can show that theta n will converge to the set of local minima of this function j. Okay, and you can see that all these algorithms, the finite difference stochastic approximation by Kiefer-Wolfowitz, the simultaneous perturbation due to SPAL, and other random search schemes would fall into one of these categories. Okay, so here is a summary of what with the SPSA algorithms that we have seen so far. The two-sided, the original one is this. The one-sided tweak by Han-Fu Chen et al. Is this, and then there is this one simulation algorithm by SPAL. Now, our goal in some of the work that we did was to somehow improve the performance of both two simulation and one simulation. Well, of course, the two simulation works well as is, but the one simulation SPSA does not work well. I mean, we have seen any number of instances where, because of the high variance, this algorithm actually does not shows poor results. So in some of the work that I did earlier, essentially what we did was to come up with a deterministic perturbation sequences that one can work through and essentially remove the randomness altogether in the perturbations and just work with the deterministic sequences. So note that these are the properties that one requires of these perturbations. You require that the expectation of the delta Jn by delta En to be 0 for all j that is not equal to I. And moreover, you require that expectation of 1 by delta Jn to be 0. Alright. So, okay, so this is what you need for the two simulation algorithm, and for the one simulation you need this, and in addition you need that as well. Okay, so one need not just have Bernoulli IID random variables, one can have more general perturbation random variables. For instance, as long as you make sure that you're not assigning a probability mass at 0 of these random variables, they could be something like this. So you have symmetry in the distribution, so they are symmetrically distributed around 0, they are mean 0, and so these random variables generated according to some distribution like this would work as well. Okay, in places directly, if you plug random samples from such a distribution into SPAL's algorithm, that would work as well. Okay, so what we care about is a deterministic perturbation construction, and I'll talk a little bit about it. So note that if you look at the space, so let's say I call S to be the set of all delta, to be delta 1 to delta n transpose, such that the delta I takes value plus or minus 1 for all I. Right, then what is the cardinality of this set? So each component can take value plus 1 or minus 1. There are n components. Sorry, 2 to the power n. That's right. So if I just enumerate all these perturbation sequences, there will be 2 power n of them, right? And what are those? Okay, so let's say I have the case of n equals 3. Let's say. So let's enumerate all of them. So here is delta 1, delta 2, and delta 3. So we start with all of them being minus 1 and end at all of them being plus 1. So this is the enumeration, and you can enumerate them in any other way. But there will be a total of 8 sequences, right? So you have plus 1, minus 1, minus 1, then plus 1. So these are the 8 of them. So if if I form, say, delta 1, I call delta 1 is this, delta 2 is this, delta 3 is this, and so on. I go up to delta 8. Okay, now if I take the, see here I need this, so what I need is that the expectation should be 0, right? I need that the expectation of delta Jn by delta In to be 0. So what I care about is this ratio. So delta 1 by delta 2, I care about delta 1 by delta 3, and I care about delta 2 by delta 3. So inverses of them will be the same as these. Right, so delta 1 by delta 2 is the same as delta 2 by delta 1 because they just take values between plus or minus 1. Right, so if you do this, calculation here, so this will be plus 1, delta 1 by delta 3 will be 1, and this is also 1, then this will be 1, delta 1 by delta 3 is minus 1, this will be minus 1, then this is minus 1, and then this is 1, and then this is minus 1. This is again minus 1, and then this is delta 1 by delta 3 is minus 1, and this will be plus 1. Okay, now we are at number 5, so delta 1 by delta 2 is minus 1, then delta 1 by delta 3 is minus 1 again, this is plus 1. Now delta 1 by delta 2 is minus 1, delta 1 by delta 3 is plus 1, and then this is minus 1. And now again we have plus 1 here, minus 1, and then minus 1, and finally we have all plus 1s, plus 1 and plus 1. Now if you run through, if you essentially sum over all of them, you can see that this sums to 2 minus 2 minus 2 plus 2, this is 0. Sum over all of them, this is again 0. Sum over these, this is 0 as well. Okay, so for a 2 simulation algorithm, I need this property, I actually need this property that the sum of these delta 1 by delta 2, delta 1 by delta 3, delta 2 by delta 3, as long as, so essentially, so these should sum to 0. Okay. In addition, if I have a 1 simulation algorithm, I need not just this, but I want 1 by delta 1 which will be the same as delta 1, 1 by delta 2 and 1 by delta 3, they should sum to 0 as well, and we can check that these are 0. So this is a property that I desire essentially. So if I want to design a deterministic perturbation algorithm, this is what I need. Now as I said, the trouble is, as you rightly pointed out, that if you enumerate all of these possibilities, then you have the cardinality of this set is 2 power n. If n is large, say n is 1000, then you have 2 power 1000. Okay, so now the problem is that you may not even be running so many simulations. Your algorithm would converge much before you have passed through this set once. So that is why in some situations, SPSS, the 2 version algorithm also doesn't do as well. Okay, so even though it does well, if you run it really for a very large parameter dimension, it won't. And the 1 simulation version does poorly anyway. Okay, so that is where the deterministic perturbation construction will help. Okay. So this is what I want. I want these sequences to satisfy this property that there should exist a P, that if I start from any S and sum all of the P subsequent elements, this quantity should be 0 in the case of 2 simulation algorithms. And for 1 simulation, I don't just need this, I need this as well. Okay, so I need both P1 and P2. So here is a Hadamard matrix based construction. Essentially, so what we said was the following. So this appeared in this paper long ago, and you can also find this in our book. I mean, so the idea is this. So you have, let's say we start off with this calling, say H2 is this matrix, which is the base matrix, and say from here you can generate an H4. So H4, the next matrix is H2, H2, H2 and minus H2. And so on. So H8 will be H4, H4, H4 and minus H4. So in that manner you can generate any matrices that have dimension 2 power n cross 2 power n, n being a variable. Okay, so So here is an example. If you put H4, this is H2, this is H2, this is H2, and this is minus H2. And these matrices are called Hadamard matrices. Okay, so normalized Hadamard. Normalized because the first row and the first column are ones. Okay, so the construction is the following. So all I need is P to be 2 power log n to the base 2. And then there's a ceiling of log n to the base 2. So look at log n to the base 2, look at the ceiling of that, and 2 power of this. Okay, so that's what you do. Okay, so suppose I have this matrix which is this, and then what I do is that if I am in the 2 simulation construction, so note that P will always be greater than or equal to n. Alright, so given that you pick any n columns from the P matrix, from the HP you pick any n columns, call them as H1 to Hn, form a matrix of it. Alright, so let that matrix be H prime P, and that will have this order P cross n. Right? And now look at the rows of this H prime P matrix and let's enumerate them. So let's call those rows as E of whatever. And so in this particular example, wherein n is 4, these are the E1 to E4, and then you can see that if you do this calculation again, this is what you will get. So as far as the 2 simulation algorithm is concerned, you just have to care about a 4-dimensional matrix. So if you had, if n is 4, you would have required 2 power 4, which is 16, would be the number of elements in this perturbation space, in the original space. Now you have reduced the number of perturbations to 4. So the perturbation space has now shrunk. Okay, and that helps in reducing the bias significantly. Now, if you have the 1 simulation construction, so the only problem is that because all the first columns, all these elements are 1, you don't want that to happen because that won't satisfy your properties. You want all columns to also sum to, each entry in each column should sum to 0. So that won't happen for the first column. So you care about that because of the 1 simulation case. And so what you do is extend. So instead of P to be 2 power log n, you let P to be 2 power log n plus 1. Okay, and that is sufficient. So then the same procedure kicks in. Okay, so what you do is then once you have okay, so here is an example. So let's say I have all these quantities and then I run through this simulation. So what I do is set this to be the delta 0, this to be delta 1, delta 2, delta 3, and cycle through again. This will be delta 4, delta 5, delta 6, delta 7, then delta 8, and so on. Okay, so you keep moving cyclically in that manner. Okay, so here is another instance of showing that the bias terms cancel away if you have n equals 3, but now note that from 2 power n you have reduced to a space that is of order n. It is either n or n plus 1. So that's the major saving. Essentially, all you need to do is to search within that space. You just move in that space of cardinality n, okay, for an n-dimensional problem. And that helps in improving the performance of your algorithm significantly, and that's what we have observed. Well, I think in the interest of time, I'll skip some of this. So there is actually one more way of doing the perturbations. Essentially, you don't have to look at Bernoulli IID. You can have, let's say, Gaussian random variables. You can work with Cauchy random variables. The form of the estimators will change. The idea here is, of course, that if you take since you need to estimate the gradient of the average cost of the expected cost, what you can do is to take the convolution of the gradient of the expected cost with a multivariate Gaussian distribution, and then you can show that it is the same as the convolution of the gradient of the Gaussian with the expected cost through an interchange argument. And now the gradient of this Gaussian PDF is the same as a scaled Gaussian PDF, and therefore this actually results in a 1 simulation algorithm. And then there are other results. Essentially, you can do the same for the Hessian and so on. And if you want to look at what all has happened in this literature, so here is some some overview of what all has happened is there is paper by Spall on Newton SPSA on force simulation algorithm. So he developed a force simulation SPSA estimator. Then, so now note that you are also estimating the Hessian in addition to the gradient, and you can do that using simultaneous perturbation based estimates. Now the problem with the Hessian estimator is that you need to invert the Hessian, and that's a complex operation. That's a computationally cost that requires a significant computational effort to invert the Hessian at each iteration. So what he also proposed was this algorithm in 2002, which essentially replaced the Hessian inverse by the geometric mean, the inverse of the geometric mean of the projected eigenvalues of the Hessian. Okay, so at each iterate you find the eigenvalues, project those eigenvalues to the positive half line and then invert. Okay, so you just replace the entire Hessian inverse by just a single number. And then we had our own algorithms. I mean, we developed, so the algorithm by Spall used 4 simulations. What we did was algorithms that use anywhere between 4 and 1. And then there was this more modification to the same algorithm by Spall. He used a weighted and feedback mechanism to tune up the Hessian. And then there was these couple of papers wherein we used Q-Gaussian perturbations. And the Q-Gaussian has a nice property that it spans all these distributions. It spans all the way from Gaussian, Cauchy and so on. So all these turn out to be special cases, and in addition you have much more than these. And in work with Prashant, we had this 3 simulation balanced estimator for the Hessian as well. And in some of the work that we recently did, we actually came up with a nice couple of algorithms for the gradient and the Newton based methods that are based only on the uniform random variable. I mean, so this is something that had not been explored previously in the literature. So what had been done was that if you look at an n-dimensional surface of a unit ball so you look at a unit ball in r power n and think of a uniform distribution on r power n, and just use that as your perturbation sequences. Now generating those are going to be complicated because of the fact that each one of these component directions are going to be dependent on each other. So what the algorithm that we proposed essentially was use the fact that you can work simply with IID uniform distributed random variates. You don't have to look at a uniform distribution on the surface of a unit sphere. Okay, and then there are algorithms that we did, similar algorithms for constrained optimization wherein you have inequality constraints. And it turns out that these techniques also work for discrete parameters stochastic optimization, wherein the underlying set is discrete. And there we came up with this idea of finding random projections onto. So you work in the continuum, so you work in the convex hull, but then at each iterate you find out where you are closest to using a random projection scheme, and then update in a similar manner. And this book essentially summarizes most of this work. Okay, so I'll now come to the Q-learning algorithm. That was so the idea is this. So let's say I have an MDP, and so the MDP sequence xn takes values in this set S, and so the action space is A, and let's say that sequence AN is this sequence of controls or actions that I pick. And I will denote by P of xn AN Zn, sorry, xn AN xn plus 1 to be the transition probabilities. And let's assume that S and A are finite sets. Alright. And so this will be the single stage cost. So if I am in state xn, I pick this action A and I move to the next state xn plus 1 and I incur this cost K of xn comma AN comma xn plus 1. So, okay, so essentially this is explaining the setting which we have seen in all these lectures, so maybe I'll just skip through most of this. So V star of I is the value function so essentially the idea is to minimize over all possible sequences of actions, the infinite horizon discounted cost. So we'll worry about the discounted cost for now. And so you can formulate it in terms of policies, and then the goal will be to find an optimal policy pi star that minimizes over all policies this quantity V pi of I. Okay, so this is a definition of a stationary deterministic policy wherein all the you are picking actions at every instant according to a given function mu. And here is a randomized policy which essentially you are picking all these actions according to a common distribution. So if you are in state I, you pick action A according to phi of I comma I. So it's a common distribution with which you pick actions. So it turns out that in infinite horizon settings, all you need to care about are deterministic policies or randomized, stationary policies in a sense. So you don't, and you can show that actually the optimal policy will have a stationary, and you can show that there will exist a stationary policy that is optimal. So all you need to care about is the setting wherein there are stationary policies, and then you optimize there. Okay, so here is the Bellman equation, and okay, so Bellman equation, and then there is this Bellman equation associated with a given stationary policy. And here is the Q-Bellman equation. So as Borkar explained, essentially if you think of this entire thing that is inside the minimum as call that as Q star of IA, then the Q-Bellman equation will essentially be this. So Q star of IA, so all you do is to plug in, instead of V star of J, you plug so note that V star of, okay, so the way it is defined, so V star of I will be minimum over A in AI of, so this quantity is Q star of IA, right? So use that fact here, and this is what you get. So that's also called as the Q-Bellman equation. Now the advantage with Q-Bellman is that it is amenable to stochastic approximation. So the reason why this is not directly amenable to stochastic approximation is because there is a minimum coming directly to the right of the equality. Here the minimum magically goes inside this conditional expectation, and therefore because stochastic approximation will give you a conditional expectation of free, so this is amenable to stochastic approximation directly. And the Q-learning algorithm is a manifestation of that. So this is the Q-learning algorithm. This is essentially, so eta n IA corresponds to the next state, and V is the action that you take in that state. Take the min over V, and Cn is the step size. Okay, so now if you have this algorithm, so you need to again run through this sequence of recursions over all feasible IA tuples. By feasible IA tuples, I mean the set of all I comma A pairs where I is in S and A is in A of I being the set of all actions that are feasible in state I. Alright, so that can be very expensive. I mean, you can't really run through all of them if S cross AS, I mean the set of all feasible tuples is a large set. And so you need to resort to approximations, and this is what is done here. So you approximate Q of IA using this function approximator. Theta is a parameter, and phi of IA are the features. Let's say think of it as a d-dimensional feature vector. And let's put all of them in this matrix phi. So phi is this matrix that has this cardinality of M cross D. M is the number of feasible state action pairs, and D is the number of columns of this matrix. And okay, so the Q-learning algorithm with function approximation is just this. Okay, so it has been widely used in applications, but the problem is that it does not, it can diverge, as Rich said. So even though, and also there have been attempts at proving its convergence, but they have not been very successful. So that was the motivation. So we came up with this idea of separating the time scales of these two operations, the minimization and the taking the average. So in the full state case, there is this paper where we did, for the full state algorithm, we did this minimization. And so the hope was that if you do it with function approximation, the resulting algorithm will work. Okay, so we work in the class of stationary randomized policies. So let's say we denote that by pi w. Okay, so it's parameterized by this quantity w. So these policies are parameterized by this n-dimensional parameter w, and theta will denote the parameter for the Q value function. And here are the assumptions. We'll assume that the Markov process sequence xn under any stationary randomized policy pi w is aperiodic and irreducible, and that these probabilities pi w are continuously differentiable in w, and moreover pi w of IA is positive for all these feasible state action tuples. Alright, and these basis functions phi k are linearly independent, and these are sort of common assumptions. I think you can sort of standard in most of the literature. So example of parameterized stationary randomized policies are the Boltzmann policies, where you that have that form, right? You have exponential of W transpose phi IA divided by the sum over all this. Now the key is that, let's say, instead of this usual stochastic approximation setting, I have a framework wherein I have an algorithm that has two iterations instead of one. Okay, so one of the iterations works with the step size an, the other runs with step size bn. Now an and bn, we know that they satisfy these properties, that the sum of these step sizes is infinity, the sum squares are finite, sum of squares. But in addition, I have this property as well. So let's say bn goes to 0 at a rate faster than an. So which means that if I have a coupled stochastic recursion, so let's say I have something like this. So say I have a quantity xn and I have a quantity yn. So the xn update proceeds in the following way. That it is xn plus say bn into f of xn comma yn, and then there's some noise, say m1 n plus 1, and then the yn update proceeds in this manner. That is yn plus an times some function g of xn comma yn plus m2 n plus 1. Okay, so these are martingale differences, m1n plus 1 and m2 n plus 1, and these are the iterates. Now because of the fact that bn goes to 0 at a rate faster than an does, so there will exist a point n0 beyond which, so for all n greater than equal to n0, under reasonable conditions on the noise and the function, you can see that the increments here that are being multiplied to bn will be uniformly, bn goes to, will be uniformly smaller than the increments here, because an is something that strictly dominates bn. Okay, and that essentially results in the following, that is, now both recursions will converge. So what that results in is, so bn is because these step sizes go to 0 at a rate faster, this iterate will be the slower iterate. It will converge in a slower manner. This will converge in a faster manner. Okay, so this iterate will be fast. Okay, so that's essentially the idea behind these algorithms, these 2 time scale stochastic approximation algorithms, that one iterate goes slower, the other faster, and as a result you can think of the slower iterate as somewhat stationary when analyzing the faster iterate. And so the faster, and when you view it from the time scale of the slower iterate, the faster iterate would have converged, and then you go back to the time scale of the slower iterate and then analyze convergence there with respect to the averaged out faster update. Okay, so here is the algorithm. So what I have done is taken the minimization now on the faster time scale. The evaluation is being done on the slower one, and that sort of helps. I mean, so because you have now removed the minimization step. So earlier here there was a minimization. What I am doing now is to separate that out. So the minimization is faster and the evaluation is being done slower. This runs actually counter to the actor critic idea, wherein the policy is the boss. Policy is essentially something that holds you. So the evaluation is done faster than the policy improvement. This runs just the opposite. What this is doing is it's updating the policy faster and doing the evaluation slower. Well, I guess in the interest of time I'll skip the analysis, but the idea is the analysis is not very straightforward, and the reason is that if you look at the convergence of the faster iterate, what we are able to show is that the faster recursion will track the stable fixed points of this, but then that's a set. Okay, so what you have is that there exists a set w theta epsilon to which wn will go to. Now you don't know anything much about that set, so when you analyze the slower recursion, what you get is a stochastic recursive inclusion. So that's not a stochastic approximation algorithm the way we understand, because it's now a point to a set valued map. And what you have is this. So if you look at h of theta, which is something like this, so there's actually a set. Okay, h of theta is a set. Now you can show that this set satisfies certain nice properties. So you can show that this is convex and compact for all theta, and that it satisfies this property that supremum over beta in this set of norm beta is upper bounded by this k times 1 plus norm theta for some k, and that this map is upper semi-continuous, which means that if theta n converges to theta and beta n to beta, such that beta n lies in this set for all n, then beta would lie, the limit would lie in this, in the limiting set. So such maps are also called as Marchot maps. Okay, so there is an extensive theory of such algorithms. So there is an extensive theory of all these algorithms by Behnam. So there is this paper by Behnam, Hofbauer and Soren in the SIAM journal on control and optimization, and which essentially deals with these stochastic recursive inclusions, wherein instead of point-to-point maps, you have point-to-set valued maps, and then how do you deal with them? So the final result is this. Okay, so the iterates converge to this set G, which is this, almost surely. And that this set G is a closed connected internally chain transitive invariant set of 14. So 14 is actually a differential inclusion. So from a point you get to this set and then you stay in that set. So essentially also one thing is clear, that this set G is compact and is closed and connected. So once you get to that set, you just stay within that set. So the iterates don't actually diverge. Okay, so that's one takeaway. I mean, so if you use 2 time scale recursions in this Q-learning update, so these sets you can ensure that the iterates will not diverge. At least that much is guaranteed, and they will converge to this set. Okay, so beyond that we are not able to tell much. So there is also a version essentially of the same algorithm for the average cost case, and I will not go into the details. Let me dive into the application directly. So finally we have this interesting application, and that has appeared in this journal on wireless networks. So the idea is this: you have let's say a region wherein you have all these sensors, okay, that have been put, and what the sensors do is that the goal for which they have been put is to make measurements, and if there is an intrusion, if someone is walking across this region, the corresponding sensor will sort of track it, will sort of capture that movement and pass it on. So that's the idea, that's the goal of each one of these sensors. So the dark line here indicates the movement by an intruder, right? And so if the sensor so now these are battery powered sensors, okay, so they have limited battery life. So now the problem is that because they are battery powered, you need to switch on and switch off. Okay, so you can't really hold them on for a very long time, because otherwise the battery will drain out and the sensor will be of no use. You want to maximize the lifetime of the sensor, because you really don't know when the intruder is going to pass by. And so you need to switch off the sensor at certain points in time and then switch it on. Once it comes back again, it can again do this job of figuring out whether the intruder is passing by. Okay, so here the goal is then to minimize the energy consumption of the sensors and keeping tracking error to a minimum. Okay, so that's what you would like to do. Now this setting involves partially observed Markov decision process, and what we did was apply the long run average cost criterion. And okay, so the sensors can be either awake or asleep, and the sleep time is assigned to be those numbers, I mean 0, 1 all the way up to some capital lambda. Okay. We'll assume that the object movement evolves as a Markov chain, and according to this transition probability matrix. Okay, so these are all, you can think of these as this entire region as a point. Okay, so this could be state 1, state 2, and so on. And so the object movement is from one grid location to the next, and so on. So those are that's the way this evolves. And so the objective is to make sensors sleep to save energy, keep maximum number of sensors awake to have a good tracking accuracy, and because these are conflicting objectives, you would like to have a good trade-off between them. Okay, so let's say we denote, so this is your state. So the state at time k is Lk comma Rk. Lk is the intruder's location at instant k. And Rk of I, so think of Rk as this vector, Rk1 to Rkn, if there are a total of n sensors. Then Rk of I is the remaining sleep time of the ith sensor. Okay, so if it was assigned a sleep time of lambda at let's say the beginning of the slot, so at the end of the slot it would still be having lambda minus 1 amount of time to sleep. So that's Rk of I. So that's the remaining sleep time, and it evolves in the following manner. So if the sensor was sleeping at the beginning at this time k to begin with, then at time k plus 1 this would be the remaining sleep time, Rk of I decremented by 1. And if it was awake there, then the goal of the decision maker is to decide how much of sleep time to assign to it. Okay, so it could be 0 as well. It might decide that, well, the sensor should not sleep at this time, so it may assign a value 0 as well. Or it may assign, so it may think that, well, it need not really need to keep awake at this time, so it may say, okay, you now go to sleep. Okay, so this is the setting. Now, as far as the single stage cost is concerned, this is just the sum of, so if the sensor is asleep, so these are all those sensors, sorry, if the sensor is awake, these are all those sensors that are awake, you incur a cost small c. Now at the same time, if you were sleeping while the intruder was there, okay, so for that particular sensor you impose a higher cost. So capital K denotes that. Okay, so there is a problem, clear problem of observability, because the intruder might be in your location while you are sleeping and you really don't know, because if you don't know, you can't capture the intruder. You don't know whether the intruder was there or not. Okay, so what one can do is to use a sufficient statistic, Pk comma Rk. So Pk is the distribution of the intruder's location, and that this Pk evolves in this manner. Okay, so if the intruder was in this location Lk plus 1, and if the remaining sleep time was 0, which means that the corresponding sensor was awake, you assign this value. So that particular location gets a value of 1. So probably you have captured it with probability 1. So that particular element gets value 1, and the rest gets 0. You know for sure that the sensor is here, sorry, the intruder is here. Otherwise, if you are sleeping at that time, then this is an estimate, Pk times P. We'll assume that we know P in this particular instance. I mean, later on, I think we also had experiments wherein P was estimated. I mean, we didn't know P, and then P was somehow estimated. Okay, so here are the results. Essentially, so this gives a comparison between Q-learning and the 2-time scale Q-learning, and then there are these QMDP and FCR algorithms by Veeravalli et al. Those were somewhat heuristic algorithms. So the first plot essentially shows the number of detects that you make per unit time as a function of the number of time steps. So the dark line is essentially the Q-learning algorithm with function approximation. The dotted line is the 2-time scale version of the same. And then there are these QMDP and FCRs denoted by this plus and cross. So note that the 2-time scale Q-learning performs almost as well as the Q-learning. The Q-learning does reasonably well in terms of the number of detects. So, and in fact, beyond this point, the 2-time scale Q-learning and the Q-learning is all about the same. The difference comes here. Okay, so if you look at, so this is a plot of the number of sensors that were awake per time step as a function of the number of time steps. Okay, so here the Q-learning algorithm essentially required as many as 60 sensors to be awake. The 2-time scale Q-learning algorithm requires almost 40, so there is a saving, clear saving there. So the 2-time scale Q-learning algorithm essentially is providing almost the same accuracy as Q-learning, but with a far less number of sensors that are awake, almost cut it down by 1/3. Okay, so that's essentially the way to look at these two plots. Okay, so and these algorithms in the literature didn't show good results. Okay, so to summarize, we looked at some recent advances in stochastic approximation algorithms, and we derived 2-time scale Q-learning algorithm with function approximation, and this algorithm was seen to be convergent. it is at least, so it converges to a set where it stays there, at least we know that. And we observed good performance of using this algorithm on a problem of adaptive sleep wake scheduling in sensor networks. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Alright, okay, yes, Satya.
So say a bit more about the stage part, the two time scale one. If you don't mind expanding a little bit more on the counterintuitive aspect of faster policy and slower value functions.
No, what I'm so what this is trying to do is to essentially mimic Q-learning. So you look at just this algorithm. So so there's the Q-learning the Q-learning algorithm with function approximation. You have the minimization over this. The minimization is over the future costs that are discounted. Now what we know is that because of the off policy problem, essentially the theta n can diverge, and that is happening because the policy is being shifted quite often here. Now if you, so the idea was that if you can separate out the time scales, because the time scale is the same when you do the evaluation and when you do the policy tuning. The time scale is the same here, and that might be causing problem. So the idea was that if you separate out the time scale, so if you do the minimization on the faster time scale and do the evaluation on the slower one, then you would essentially, the hope was that it would mimic Q-learning but in a better manner. And it does, and that's what we observed. And one is able to even show convergence of this algorithm. So even though we know that there have been attempts at proving convergence of Q-learning with function approximation, but there have been others who have found faults with those proofs, and so it's not really, and there are counter examples where it diverges. I would be interested in knowing whether our algorithm diverges. If you can come across counter examples, that would be interesting. At least it does well in this setting. I mean, we have tried in other settings too. Wherein you have a multi-stage routing problem and so on. It does better than Q-learning, because Q-learning with function approximation, we have observed that it has high variance in the iterates. This does not have. I mean, so it's sort of does much better in comparison. Does that answer your? Yeah.
Placed uniformly. If we change
Here.
the sensor placed uniformly, if we change the if we place it non-uniformly, then will it change the settings?
Yeah. So of course.
But I'm asking because it's making it more reality. That we can't place all the.
Yeah, so you will have to somehow take care of the fact. So what you are saying is, well, some sensors may be more powerful, they may cover a larger area,
Yes,
and some
yes.
sensors, yeah, you
That's
could do that. I mean, we haven't explored, but I think that should work too.
I mean, in this application, what was the objective? Because in terms of comparison with just Q-learning, it seems like you had
No,
the same
the overall objective was to track the intruder. So you
no,
want
but you had a couple of plots in the
Yes,
two more slides
okay.
ahead.
So this is the single stage cost function,
Yeah, I understand this, but
and then
have
you
to-
look at the corresponding long run average of it.
Yeah. So in this plot, you are comparing the 2-time scale version with vanilla version, is it?
With
On the
yeah,
left-hand side.
right.
And on the right-hand side, you're claiming that the
So
number of
it's-
sensors awake is lesser in your.
Yeah, so how
baseline.
many, so the right hand plot is of the how many sensors are awake per time step as a function of the number of time steps.
Wouldn't you? I mean, if this was a metric to optimize for, then shouldn't that be in the? Shouldn't that be part of the cost? Shouldn't that be a part of the rewards in terms of the K and the C values?
No, can you say that again? I can't hear.
No, I'm just wondering if if this was the second plot was the objective to reduce the number of senses awake, then you would penalize more in your reward function.
So essentially it's not just the number of sensors awake. I mean, because if you just use the objective that you want to minimize the number of sensors awake, then essentially you would have no sensors that are awake. So you have to care about the tracking accuracy as well. So you have to take the combination of the two. And that's what the objective is doing. Alright, so since I am also the moderator, so we'll now move for lunch. Thanks all.